digital forensics and digital evidence and blockchain. So we will have a bit of everything. When I asked IARIA how long the presentation should take, they said about 20 minutes. So I try to do 20 minutes. But of course, we can have longer time for questions of everything. So I will talk about poison evidence. So I will, of course, explain what it is and how we can handle this kind of evidence in the blockchain. So for presenting myself, so I am a sworn expert to the French and the Swiss courts, and also to the International Criminal Court in The Hague, in the Netherlands. I am associate professor at the University of Applied Sciences in Geneva, which is in Switzerland, in Europe. I'm also lecturer at various universities at Stockholm, in Sweden, or Lausanne, also in Switzerland. And I used to have also a private activity with forensics, dealing with forensics. So first, forensic science, perhaps. Before, okay, forensic science is now a science by itself, and it is used. Is how can you use science to serve fighting against crime, basically? But it has a larger scope because you can use also forensics in insurance. I know that you're working on insurance or in healthcare or in a lot of things. So forensic science is the study of traces, so what is left from an activity. So it's used for detection of something, observation, collection, but also identification of individuals or computers or things, individualization and authentication, and determining the probative value of evidence, which means that not all traces are good in a trial. Okay, some are more probative than others, and so we have to select which one is better than the others. And that's the study of traces and the link among traces, because sometimes when you are processing a criminal case, then you have multiple suspects or multiple victims, and then you have to correlate things. It is used also to detect series. So in Europe, there is not this kind of, in the US, you have series, you have serial killers, you have serial things, etc. In Europe, you have less of them, but more and more you see that appearing. And also it's to understand phenomena and structures, because you have to understand how criminals are driving their business in order to fight them. Okay, and we will see more links among traces in that speech. Okay, so now the chain of custody or chain of evidence. So when you are processing a criminal case, or even in civil cases, you know, when companies are fighting one against the other, or individuals or organizations, then you have to document in a chronological way with paper or with computers all the sequence of custody. So when you take something, an evidence, okay, how you can control it, transfer it, analyze it, this, and at the end, how you dispose of the physical thing. It is used in criminal cases, okay, civil litigations and arbitration also for those who are. But also in supply chain management, in financial audit, or whatever, you know, in supply chain management, for example, for food, okay, to trace food from where the food is coming until your dish. That's it. So how it is materialized. So, for example, that's a very simple chain of custody label, where there is the description of the evidence and then the chain of custody. So, for example, the description of evidence. So this is item 1. There is one quantity. That's an iPhone of Mr. Suspect. And the chain of custody is that, well, yesterday, I took the iPhone, and the iPhone was hidden in a jar. And then today, then I pass the evidence to Mr. Do, and he will perform a memory dump on the device, okay, and etc., 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 until it goes to the end. So usually, when you have physical evidence, then, well, when you process the evidence, then you bag the evidence. So in some series, you have very fancy bags, etc. But when you are dealing with some kind of with an iPad or something else, then you have to wrap that. And in France, we have this. I don't know if you can see it. Perhaps no. Yeah, you have to seal also with. And even the red color is codified, so you cannot use another red color. It's this red color. Okay, but you cannot bag digital assets. Okay, if you have an email, then okay, you can copy it, you can print it, and then bag it. But that's not the real one. Okay, so you have to use something to keep all the digital assets. So we can use blockchains, because blockchains are, okay, a chronologically a sequence of events or some things, and then you can, okay, you can record everything. In our case, we are using permission blockchain, which means that we are not using a proof of work or a proof of stake. We are the people who are doing the validation of transaction or blocks are people with credentials. So they have the right to do that. And in the judiciary system, then you have many kind of people, and from law enforcement to the judges, etc. So each of them has the possibility to validate or not some transaction. Okay, so permission blockchain uses an access control layer to control the network access and to control who can validate transaction and blocks. If you are looking at the not permissioned blockchain, permissionless, then permissioned blockchain use pseudonymous when you are not identified on the network. That's, for example, for Bitcoin or this kind of stuff. And you are using a consensus algorithm. For example, with Bitcoin, you have a proof of work. With Ethereum, you have proof of stake. And for example, for the permissioned blockchain, we can use a Hyperledger, which is an IBM tools, toolbox for blockchain. And they are using practical Byzantine fault tolerance, which is another kind of validation. Okay, now more to the topic. So I will be using a small scenario. So the police searches Miss Marple's home, and Miss Marple is suspected to host a suspected man running from the police. So there is a runaway guy, and the police thinks that he is hiding at Miss Marple's home. So the police find 3 evidence items at her home. The first one is found by Agent Poirot, and he found a USB key with the searchman identity documents and 1,000 bitcoins. Agent Ness found a notebook with pornographic content and a hyperlink to a web server. And Agent Locke found a love letter from the suspected man to Miss Marple. And later, the website is investigated by Agent Chris, and it contains drug recipes. Okay. So that's just a small scenario. And then how will these evidences, but they are all digital evidence, will be processed? So we can think about inventory blockchain, for example. The first transaction here, the USB key, will be stored. So first, well, that's the root hash. First, the agent Poirot's public key will not sign, but will encrypt the hash coming, and we will have an encrypted hash here, and it will be signed with the root private key, and we have a root signature. Then we take this transaction, we hash the transaction, And the hash is then equipped by agentness public key. Everybody is familiar with public key and private key. Okay? Then this hash is in turn signed with the agent Power's private key. Okay, so we have Power's signature there. And again, this transaction is hashed, then encrypted with agent log's public key, and it gives a hash. And then this hash is signed by agentness private key, and etc. until the end of the. So that's the blockchain. Well, the kind of blockchain. Of course, you can have multiple ways to inventory the digital evidences, but this is a simple way to do that. And when you have to verify if an evidence is really an evidence, then you will use for example, the agent power public key to see if the signature is correct. And then again, the agentness public key to see if the signature is correct, and etc. Then you have your blockchain is okay, then you can go on. So now the transaction verification. So transaction validated by authorized law enforcement, or that because it is a permissioned blockchain. And since it is a permissioned blockchain, there is no need of proof of work and no need of proof of stake. You just have to have a consensus algorithm among the different networks. So you have your blockchain, which is distributed. Okay. And that's where I'm coming in. Further in the investigations, you don't have only police officers or judges. You have also lawyers and attorneys. And the defense of Ms. Marper argues that pornographic materials and drug recipes are not the subject of the search and should be dismissed because the search was concerning a runaway guy from the police and there's no pornographic thing or whatever. And the court, so judge, that's not possible because there's nothing to do with the first warrant that you have. And the court say, okay, that should be dismissed. So the judges, Roy and Prince, have to delete transaction 2 and 4. But the problem is that we have a blockchain, and the purpose of the blockchain is that if you tamper with the blockchain, then the blockchain is no longer valid. So how do you dismiss evidences when there is a blockchain? So that's the purpose of my talk. So what we cannot do? So what we cannot do is, of course, to delete this transaction and delete this transaction, because then you cannot verify that this transaction 3 is linked to this one, because you lose the context. So that's something you cannot do. So, of course, okay, this hash is no more valid, and this signature, you cannot use it. So the blockchain is broken. And, okay. So what we can do is voiding the whole blockchain. So we can dismiss everything and we start anew. But if we start anew, so you have to find agent powers, supposing that is still there, and agent log, supposing is still there also, and etc. And you have all the officials have to do again all the signing and the hashing and etc. So it may be some problems because sometimes people are not there, are no more there, and if a transaction was validated before, then this transaction is no more valid. There is a new transaction, and perhaps lawyers uses the transaction ID to do some stuff. And okay, and also by restarting anew, we lose the fact that 2 evidences have been dismissed by a court order. That means that okay, we have something, but we don't know what happened to the evidence. And all the validators must validate again. And a query for a dismissed transaction. So imagine that you have the ID of the transaction, because before it was void, you try to retrieve the information of this transaction, then it's an error. And you don't know if it is because the transaction is not valid or because the item has been dismissed or whatever. So we can use undo transactions, like in DBMS. I don't know if you are familiar with transaction processing in DBMS when so basically, you have your blockchain, then you are issuing undo transactions. For example, transaction -2 is voiding transaction 2. and transaction -4 is undoing transaction 4. And then you add transactions, you don't touch anything there, and then you can dismiss the transaction. But again, there is a small problem, because to see if this transaction is void, then you have to pass the whole blockchain until the end, or until you find the undo transaction. So given the transaction ID, how do we know if it is legally valid? Because it will be valid because it is in the blockchain and you have all the hashes and signatures that are okay. But from a legal point of view, you don't know, okay, until you go to the end of the blockchain. So if we are presented with transaction 2 or ID 2, we have to go to the undo transaction -2 to discover it is no longer valid. From a legal point of view, it is still from a technical, but from a legal point of view, it's not valid. And so for each transaction, all the blockchain is passed from beginning to T. If it is transaction T, T is technically valid, okay? And from T to the end, or -T, it is legally valid if you are going to the end and not find any dismissed transaction, or until -T if you find it is dismissed. So the complexity, you have to do twice the blockchain. Well, it's square, or not square, square. So we found another solution, because we imagine that it's not very convenient for the legal system to have this kind of things. And we are building an additional blockchain, which is recording dismissed transaction. So we separate, just a small introduction of the talk. Not yet.
Vous les chercher, puis dès que vous pouvez, vous me les remplissez.
D'accord, mais si vous pouvez venir peut-être en train de parler, c'est enregistré. Ça marche, merci beaucoup. Okay, sorry for this small French interruption, but it's about food. So, you know, in France, food is important. So I cannot delay that. So now we can resume the presentation. So we are using an additional blockchain recording dismissed transactions. We call that invalidate transaction. And it stores only dismissed transactions, or dismissed evidence. So for example, this is the whole blockchain pictures. We have here the blockchain of evidence, normal one. And then we have another blockchain with links to the inventory blockchain, and it stores only dismissed transaction. And if we are going to the algorithm, well, graphically, if I want to know if transaction 1 is valid from a legal point of view, then I first go to an access control, and it goes to the first blockchain and asks if it is legally correct. That is, if it is not in this blockchain, then it can be legally correct. Okay. And then I look at the other blockchain if it is technically correct. So it has been registered and all the hashes are okay. And then it says, okay, yes, and it gives back the payload. And the payload may be contents or just a reference to a content, which is better. That's for transaction 1. For transaction 2, is the hash valid, or first, it is legally correct? Well, no, because transaction is invalidated by court order number XXX. Okay, that is the payload of the transaction. And for example, transaction 5, which not exist, so it is legally correct, then maybe it's legally correct, but technically correct, no. Okay, transaction is not found. And with this additional structure, we can manage all the cases that can happen with the evidences and have the feedback of the system, which is the evidence legally correct, is the evidence technically correct, has been dismissed or not, or when, etc. And the verification algorithm, well, that's what I explain graphically. So if the hash of the transaction is not in the invalidated blockchain, then if this hash is in the inventory blockchain, then that's okay. We can return the payload. Otherwise, we can return transaction not found in the case it is not in inventory takes, or transaction invalidate, like court order that time is judged, etc. The complexity is lower because the complexity to have the transaction X in invalidated takes is in n, so n being the number of invalidated transactions. If you don't have any invalidated transaction, then it is 0, so that's very fast, or 1. And n is the number of transactions in inventory takes, which is, you cannot do less than that. And the fact that T has been dismissed is recorded, which is important. Okay. So why we use the poisonous evidence in our talk? It's because in the legal systems in the US, I think it was in the US in the first time, when the lawyer said, well, when you have a poison evidence, then you have a kind of poisonous tree from this evidence. That means that every evidence originated from this first evidence, which is dismissed, is also dismissed, where it's also poisoned. So we could perhaps automate these things of this evidence is dismissed, then we can find all the evidence related to this first evidence. But in fact, the legal system is not always straightforward. And sometimes you can have evidence that are linked to another previously dismissed evidence, but which are still valid. Perhaps because they were done in another country with another law or with whatever. So sometimes you find that some evidences will stay and other will be dismissed, even if they are related. So we cannot automate that very easily, but maybe we can pursue it. And then last, it's privacy protection. So I am doing forensics, and when I'm doing forensics, I have a huge amount of private data that I'm, for example, I'm investigating a cell phone from a suspect. Okay, I have this, for example, for drugs or I don't know, murder or something. But I have also all his contact information. I have all his photos from other people, etc. So a lot of information that have nothing to do with the case. And for that, I think that the payload must not be part of the transaction. It's only a reference to a safe storage, because if the payload is part of the transaction, it cannot be dismissed, because once it is in the blockchain, it is in the blockchain. So only a reference to a safe storage is recorded. And then when we are deleting a transaction, then for each transaction, if the evidence is the one we are looking for, then we add a new transaction to invalidate X. That's the blockchain, the additional blockchain that we use. And we erase the safe storage content. So the link to the safe storage is still there, but it goes nowhere, in fact. And then we have this privacy, which is done almost. Of course, these two things must be done in an atomically way. That means that you have the two together, or not one, not total. Okay, so conclusion now. I think I am almost in time. So our solution helps in the management of tainted digital evidence in criminal investigations. So tainted or poisoned. We remove the dismissed transaction in a linear complexity. We are keeping the fact that evidences have been dismissed, which is, I think, important. At least it always surfaces in trials when I go to try to testify. The dates and the evidence is still valid or not. It's always, there are arguments about that. And we are still providing privacy protection over sensible data. So we are using two blockchain layers with an access control. That's our solutions. Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Okay, so if you have questions.
I would really like to read the book. The narrative is great.
But in fact, there was a real case with a lady, and She was not Miss Marple, but she was Miss. I don't remember. I think I put it in
privacy.
Yeah, and it was almost the same thing, where the man was searched for bombing or something like that, and he was hiding at her house, and then the police found pornographic material, which was illegal at the time. It was in the. And then the lawyer of this lady said, okay, but it was not part of the search. And then they dismissed, and the term poisonous evidence comes from this case. In the US.
I started, as I was following along, like, I think I misunderstood for a little bit because I was thinking that being able to change the blockchain could introduce the vulnerability, but then I realized you're not really changing the blockchain, you're just adding
yes.
entries, so the ledger is still.
Exactly, you have two ledgers. You have two ledgers which are related, but you have two ledgers, and the blockchain, the original blockchain, is not touched.
Exactly, and I thought that was really fascinating. To show just how secure blockchain really is for chain custody and all those pieces that go along with it. So really fascinating presentation. Really, no, seriously, that's good stuff. Because that's really teachable stuff in the classroom.
Yeah.
To help students understand, how these kinds of things work. Because there's so much you can lose, especially in cyber forensics.
Yeah.
If you don't keep a really good chain of custody, that is hard to prosecute if you don't have the evidence really locked down.
Yeah, and you have such a huge number now that even for just a computer or just a cell phone, you have hundreds of thousands of evidences, and so you have to keep track of everyone. So now you have to have systems. You cannot do that by hand like we were doing that 20 years ago, but now it's no longer possible.
One the next dismissed evidence, and the second successor, the one that relates, that is dismissed.
Well, in fact, in blockchains, you have transactions, but transactions are validated in blocks usually, and each transaction has one successor. Yeah, no, there is only one in every direction. Except that in my proposal, then you have this upper blockchain that has also a link to the other. So yes, there are two predecessors, in fact, for each transaction, for if it is dismissed, but not in the same blockchain.
You want to do some labeling of evidence is revoked. This effect is revoked because evidence is revoked. I was thinking about might use it in the semantic representation, what kind of link.
Well, it's a causality, I think. It's if A depends on B, then if B is void, then A should be void. But that's the scientific way of reasoning. That's not the legal way of reasoning. They have completely different minds. And sometimes a lawyer will say, no, okay, B is dismissed, but since A was done in this country and the law of this country applies even in that case, you never know. In fact, when you are going to a trial, you never know the outcome because sometimes lawyers will raise some legal things that you don't even aware of that, and some work will be dismissed.
That you can conclude that it should be not dismissed, but you cannot.
No, you cannot. In fact, even if you find that the guy is guilty with some evidence that is proved dismissed, then it is. I had a case. It was a sexual predator. He was looking for young ladies and very, very young ladies, and then he was doing blackmail with cameras first, and then he was asking for physical encounters. Then there was rape, and then even he was asking money from the ladies, etc. Until one day, one of the young ladies asked tell her mother that it was okay. And the only evidences was my report. And in my report, because you are also learning from your errors. So in my report, I put some screenshots of the dialogue between the guy and the woman, and I said, okay, this in this dialogue we see the blackmail from this user to this other user. And then the lawyers, the defense lawyers said, okay, the expert made a report, but he was already convinced that my client was blackmailing the lady, because blackmail is also a juridical term in France. So you cannot use the same, it's a common language term, and it's also a legal term. And he said, okay, when he wrote a report, so he had, well, he was speaking already that my client was guilty, so the report must be dismissed. And everything against the guy was in the report. There was not other evidence. So fortunately, the court didn't follow the lawyer, but so even just for a small term, it was perhaps 150 pages and plenty of images, videos, because it was taping everything. Was going to. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But it happens.
It's usual argumentation.
Yeah.
Is it right? True. Bias, character assassination.
I mean, whether it applies reasonably in this case is one thing, but let's say if there's an expert giving an opinion on the case, so asking critical questions that in a sense attack whether this is an expert in the field for the case at hand, or whether the expert is biased. Well, this is in the field, those don't relate to what my paper is.
Yeah.
So I'm not dealing with the argumentation per se, but it's one in the background.
Mm-hmm.
But very nice connection there. So that's about the field of competition models of natural argument, how this is called. And it's, much of it is also application in law. But let's say the perspective is completely different. So no one takes care of security, of evidence, and so complex data storage and maintenance. But the argumentative chains are more complex than case. So it's basically an application of monopolic logic. So in a sense, it represents more. So you represent only the evidence.
Yeah.
And whether the evidence is in or out, well, one could also argue that, okay, there is a piece of evidence, it's dismissed. Then it's an argument of the other side, okay, no, it should be in because this and this, and then it may get in again, so this may change a few times in.
Yeah, but
maybe not frequently. But
no, but you are absolutely right. So there is a European initiative, a cost action. I don't know if you're familiar with cost action about digital forensics and AI, with the whole AI term being with answer set programming, machine learning, well, whatever. And so we are meeting since 1 year and a half, and we are trying to, okay, what use can be done with AI, whichever field, subfield in AI, to digital forensics. And one of them is, yes, that's how you are arguing with the evidence. But it's still very in an early stage. There is a lot of work. Thank you. Okay, so now I have to stop my recording, and then I will see.